Tell me not in mournful numbers, life is but an empty dream, for the soul is dead that slumbers, and things are not what they seem. House of LaVey. Late at night, as the fog rolls in across the San Francisco Bay and the air turns cold, the people turn off their lights and go to sleep. But in one of those darkened houses, a house that looks much like the others, except for the fact that it was once painted black, the occupants are not asleep, nor are they under the realm of Morpheus, for the structure is reigned over by Satan. What was once the living room now serves as a chamber for ceremonies of the devil. As the satanic mass commences, about 20 people sit in a semicircle before a combination fireplace altar constructed from ballast stones of old sailing ships. A black coffin stands on end in one corner of the room. In the opposite corner is a golden mummy case bearing the carved likeness of a long-dead Egyptian king. Candles are lit, 13 black and 1 white, and the lights are turned off. The black candles are used to burn parchments on which requests for blessings have been written. The lone white candle is used to burn parchments upon which curses have been penned. The flickering candlelight is readily absorbed by the blood-red ceiling and black walls of the chamber. The male participants wear black robes, some of which are hooded. The women also wear black, but their garments are sexually suggestive. Suddenly, the grim silence is broken by the ear-shattering sound of a bell, rung by the cult's high priestess, an attractive woman with long blonde hair. The bell, rung to purify the air of all extraneous sounds, signals the beginning of the ritual. An organist plays the eerie strains of a dirge of Bach. As the participants rise, the Black Pope of the Church of Satan enters. He wears a cap with 2 protruding bone horns, and with his long pointed ears, triangular goatee, and black Fu Manchu mustache, his appearance is strikingly satanic. He cradles a bundle wrapped in a leopard skin in his arms. The exotic covering falls to one side momentarily to reveal the face of a beautiful blonde woman. Her fair skin and extraordinary beauty present an exotic but ghastly contrast to the high priest's black robes and macabre appearance. She will serve as a living altar during the ritual and incantations. The woman is carried across the dimly lit chamber and is gently placed on the stone altar, of which she becomes a part. The leopard skin is peeled back, exposing an utterly flawless nude body. The participants murmur, "Hail Satan!" in awed tribute. Then a gong is sounded to call upon the forces of darkness. The naked woman who has become a human altar is the subject of fantasy for millions of moviegoers around the world. But this is not a movie set. It is for real. Only her most intimate friends are aware of the dark secret side of her life. The Black Pope continues the rite. In the name of Satan, the ruler of the earth, the king of the world, I command the forces of darkness to bestow their infernal power upon me. The naked woman reposing upon the altar appears even more strikingly beautiful as the dim candlelight enhances even the slightest movement. The heretofore motionless body of Vera Jane Palmer begins to throb visibly as the ritual reaches a fiery climax. Hail Satan! Vera Jane Palmer, better known as Jane Mansfield, was deeply involved in the blackest of the occult arts at the time of her death in 1966. Her pink 37-room Bel Air mansion, built in the 1920s by entertainer Rudy Vallee, but never lived in by him, was often the site of seances, coven meetings, and other mystical ceremonies. It is a part of her life that the producers of a recent television special neglected to disclose. In fact, all but one of her many biographers have shied away from the more bizarre aspects of Jane Mansfield's life. Although her friends warned her that she was playing with fire, Jane continued to experiment with the black arts. Jane Mansfield was one of America's top pinup girls, and her movie studio was grooming her to be another Marilyn Monroe. Crowds thronged around her wherever she went, and she was making an enormous amount of money. She lacked nothing except happiness. Jane and her estranged third husband, Matt Keimer, were in the middle of a child custody suit, and the turmoil was rapidly consuming her. Divorce proceedings had been underway for some time, and to further complicate matters, her attorney, Sam Brody, was not only ripping her off, but blackmailing her, according to Anton LaVey. Jane first met Anton Xander LaVey during the 1966 San Francisco International Film Festival. After she had read some newspaper stories about him and his San Francisco-based Church of Satan, Jane was enthralled with the philosophy, theatrical trappings, and basic concepts of Satanism. She began attending the satanic rituals on a regular basis, usually flying up from Los Angeles. Sometimes she accompanied LaVey on his investigations of haunted houses in the Bay Area. One can imagine the scene as America's #1 sex symbol was met at the airport by a diabolical-looking man in a sinister black garb. After fighting their way through the celebrity-hungry crowds, they would enter LaVey's black Jaguar sedan and, with back seat full of Jane's pink luggage, drive to the black house on California Street. Once away from the airport, Jane's privacy was of the utmost importance. Sometimes her arrival at the sanctuary was timed to occur after dark. Other times, a hat and veil shielded her. Even the bedroom in which she stayed was entered through a secret opening in the wall. Much of the secrecy was maintained because of Sam Brody, Jane's companion and attorney. Jane sought counseling from LaVey. She confided to him that on several occasions, Brody had drugged her and taken nude pictures of her lying in bed with strange men. He had threatened to release the pictures to the right people in her child custody suit. Thus, he was able to gain sexual favors from her. It was also discovered that Brody had been double billing her for his services and stealing both money and jewelry from her. LaVey told Jane that Brody's treachery was a problem she would have to solve herself, but he would show her the way. Thus, Jane Mansfield, who had already been a student of the occult arts, became one of the Church of Satan's more enthusiastic members in 1966. Eventually, she became a priestess. We were granted an interview with the Black Pope of the Church of Satan in June 1980. Sworn to secrecy regarding the exact location, we were afforded the rare opportunity of encountering LaVey in his home in the north of San Francisco. For those who are not familiar with LaVey, he is a well-proportioned 6-footer, attired all in black except for a maroon striped tie. That was our first look at Anton Xander LaVey. He is a most devilish-looking man. The study's backlighting gave his long pointed ears a translucent reddish neon quality. As LaVey's lips parted in a half smile, I saw long, sharply pointed, glistening white teeth. If any practitioner of the black arts looked the role of the evil one, it is certainly Anton LaVey. After the initial shock, however, he seemed quite pleasant. He greeted us in a soft-toned masculine voice and formally introduced himself. When Diane, LaVey's wife, returned with our coffee, the interview began. After he explained how Jane Mansfield had become involved in the Church of Satan, I asked about the notorious curse that supposedly led to her death and that of her companion. LaVey replied, contrary to what several uninformed sources have said, there never was a curse placed on Jane Mansfield. She was an active member in good standing with the Church of Satan until the very end. In fact, when she was killed, she was wearing her Baphomet. It was one that we had made especially for her, pink enameled. Actually, the curse you mentioned was placed on Sam Brody, Jane's attorney. He'd been giving her a rough time and even embarrassing her in public. At the San Francisco International Film Festival, he threw liquor all over her dress. He was enraged at her enthusiasm for the Church of Satan. He had blackened her eyes and beaten her up on many occasions. What was the curse that you put on Brody? I asked. The death curse. Because he was a pest, a nuisance, he wouldn't leave her alone. Brody was probably so deeply emotionally involved with her that he couldn't control himself. He might have been a very kind, sweet man at one time, but passion can do strange things to people. He threatened me and set up very unpleasant situations. In other words, he tried to make my life as unbearable as possible. Brody followed Jane everywhere she went, despite her attempts to shake him. He'd find out when she was coming to see me, and then he'd take an earlier flight so that he would be there waiting when she disembarked. Jane unloaded her problems with Brody on me daily. When she returned from San Francisco, furniture would be missing from her home, or she'd find bills for services if she had not been authorized, or in some cases not even performed. Brody padded his statements and sometimes double-billed her. Actually, Brody had her in a very delicate position. Supposedly, he represented her legally, but he had her so compromised that she couldn't leave him. He arranged that she was so deeply in debt to him for legal services that if he had demanded payment, the consequences would have been terrible, and if she didn't conform to his personal wishes, he threatened to have custody of her children withdrawn, have her declared an unfit mother. As an attorney, he could probably have accomplished that too. How do you put a curse on someone? I asked. I had previously placed 2 death curses on persons, but it was very spontaneous in this case. Because he threatened me over the telephone, he had just finished beating Jane up, breaking the door down and making a big scene. She was screaming for help over the telephone, crying pitifully. He took the phone from her and told me that I was never to speak to Jane again. He said if I continued to befriend her, even to answer her calls, he would expose me as a charlatan and instigate all sorts of legal actions against me. I got very angry and told him that he had underestimated me because up to that point I'd been a gentleman for Jane's sake. I'd taken a lot of verbal abuse from him, and I'd seen others take his verbal and physical abuse as well, but I hadn't done anything about it. Finally, I felt Brody should be warned that he was dealing with greater powers than he'd ever dreamed of, and that all of his threats would amount to nothing. I said to him, go ahead, expose and attack me and be damaged, because in a year you shall be dead. It was as simple as that. He just slammed down the phone without saying another word. A few minutes later, Jane called back. Apparently Sam was worried and pacing because he got on the phone and said, all is forgiven. Just forget what I said. Everything is all right. But I replied that things were not all right. You did things in the church you shouldn't have done. You disrupted the services, rearranged and lit our ceremonial candles, and committed atrocities and pieties and other things. I even had to call the police to forcibly eject you on several occasions. No, I said, it's not all right. When asked if anyone had tried to warn Jane not to take Brody with her on the fatal trip, LaVey replied, I did. I told her. She knew the effectiveness of the curse. She just couldn't shake him. I warned her to stay away from him. I pleaded with Jane, begged her to avoid the man. I explained that Brody was traveling under a dark sign, and there was no way he could escape. But she wouldn't listen. She just wouldn't listen. LaVey was referring to 2 automobile accidents that Brody had while Jane was with him. One occurred on a Monday morning in mid-June at the intersection of Sunset and Whittier in Beverly Hills. Although Jane escaped injury, Brody suffered a broken leg, a broken elbow and thumb, and lost 2 teeth. His late model Mercedes was destroyed. Both his leg and arm were in casts when, a week later, Jane and Brody were involved in another car accident. They were in San Francisco, and Brody had refused to allow Jane to ride in LaVey's black Jaguar. Neither suffered injuries from the mishap. Still, Jane would not heed Anton LaVey's warning to stay away from the accursed Sam Brody. A week later, in the early morning hours of June 29, 1967, after finishing her evening performance at Gus Stevens Supper Club in Biloxi, Mississippi, Jane, 3 of her children, Sam Brody, and the club's driver, 19-year-old Ron Harrison, started driving to New Orleans, where she was scheduled to appear on a television talk show later that morning. Jane stood nearby as the kids and the luggage were packed in the car. She looked tired, haggard, and hungover. Harrison was driving with Brody in the middle of the front seat, and Jane sat beside him next to the door. As the children slept in the back seat, the 1966 Buick sedan raced west along Route 90. The road was slick from a light rain that had started falling earlier. Ahead, Harrison saw a large white cloud coming from a mosquito spraying truck. He slowed down and followed the truck for several minutes, then became impatient, accelerated, and drove around the spray truck into the fog. It was 2:25 a.m. Since childhood, Jane had a fear of driving in the rain. It probably began when she was riding with her parents through a rainstorm in eastern Pennsylvania. Her father suddenly slumped over the wheel and died instantaneously. Fortunately, Jane's mother was able to grab the wheel and guide the car to a safe stop. It was very probable that Jane was haunted by the tragic experience while driving in the rain with Harrison and Brody that night. On June 28, in an orchid-colored house in Dallas, Texas, Jane's mother, Vera Pierce, suddenly sat up in bed. A nightmare had startled her out of the sound sleep. In it, Jane had called to her, "Mother, Mother, come here, I want you, Mother." When Vera Pierce went back to sleep, her daughter again appeared and took her by the hand. She was smiling, and Mrs. Pierce, she was wearing a black hat, and so was I. She told me, "You must be careful, Mother. I will help you. We are going down those steps." We were standing on the top of some marble stairs, beautiful ones with birds and angels carved in them. There were hundreds of beautiful steps. There are many people gathered at the bottom, and Jane said, "Don't worry, Mother. I know those people. I'm going to introduce you to them." About that point in her dream, Vera was awakened by a knock at the door. She and her husband answered it. Mrs. Pierce, a Texas state trooper, said, "I have some very bad news for you. Your daughter, Jane Mansfield, had been involved in a serious automobile accident." Harrison did not know that a slow-moving trailer truck was ahead of him until the hood of the Buick slammed under it. The top of the Buick was sheared off as though it was a giant sardine can. Sam Brody died instantly when he was thrown from the car. Harrison suffered the same fate. The children in the back seat were alive but sustained injuries. When the truck driver, who was unhurt, leapt from his cab, he saw the bodies of 2 men sprawled on the pavement. Glancing into Buick's windshield, he saw the bloodied head of a blonde woman gaping through the smashed glass. Then, looking back on the roadway, he saw a woman's body. His eyes scanned from the blue boots to the blue mini dress, past the blood-soaked blouse to the shoulders. His gaze stopped abruptly. There was no head. LaVey later declared that Jane was the victim of her own frivolity. Many members of California's occult underground were of the opinion that LaVey's curse got out of control, killing both the disciple and the non-believer. Shortly after Jane's death, a memorial service was held at the Church of Satan. About 30 persons were present. Halfway through the ritual, the amber-colored bulbs suddenly flared up. The lights didn't merely become brighter, but rather blazed to the intensity of photo flood bulbs for almost half a minute. It was as though there had been an immense increase in the voltage. Yet the filaments, which should have burned out from such a sudden surge in voltage, were undamaged, and the bulbs were still usable. One of the glaring bulbs, the one over the altar, flared up into a heart-shaped form, which was Jane's favorite design. The swimming pools, bathtubs, and other possessions at her home were heart-shaped. Asked whether he had anything to do with the spontaneous flaring of the lights, LaVey replied, "Anyone can rig bulbs to flare up like that, but to do so without damaging them is impossible. I think Jane wanted to let us know that she is still with us." After Jane's tragic departure from the world, her estate became the subject of considerable legal dispute between legitimate heirs, would-be heirs, and freeloaders. Everyone wanted a piece of the action. Her children, estranged husband, ex-husband, business associates, Brody's wife, attorneys. Lawyers later declared that no less than $600,000 of the $1 million estate would be spent in legal fees and expenses. Martha Saxton, in her biography of Jane Mansfield, referred to the fiasco as a lawyer's picnic. As the rightful heirs watched their shares dwindle, other unexplainable things were happening. Linda Mudrick, Jane's personal maid, had on a number of occasions heard Miklos, Jane's oldest son, who saw his mother's decapitated body at the accident scene, talking to someone when she knew he was alone in his room. He told her, "I've been talking with Mommy. She comes here a lot to visit me." The maid's reaction was that Jane was calling on her son from the spirit world. Other bizarre occurrences were happening in and around the Pink Palace. Mickey Haggerday, Jane's second husband, had a bad car accident just after driving out the gate. Third husband, Matt Keimer, who was estranged from her at the time of her death, began having his share of troubles too. His father had a heart attack, legal problems were falling upon his newly acquired nightclub, and his best friend was killed. Then Linda herself was involved in a serious auto crash. One day a plaque appeared on the wall of Jane's pink bedroom over her heart-shaped bed. It was a certificate from Anton Zander LaVey's Church of Satan, proclaiming Jane a priestess. No one knows how it got there. LaVey hadn't been in the house during that time. Victor Houston, a relatively young man who was Jane's road manager and constant visitor at the Pink Palace, died suddenly. Two of Jane's children, Miklos and Maria, both of whom survived the fatal car wreck, were playing in a toy electric car one afternoon in the mansion's playground. Maria leaned back and somehow her long black hair became entangled around an axle. All of the hair on the back of her head was sheared off at the roots. Bursting water pipes spoiled much of the furnishings. Plumbers who repaired the damage became frightened by mysteriously moving objects. One painter said that whenever he was working in Jane's room, he felt that he was not alone. even though no one else was in the room. Several times he actually felt someone touch him on the shoulder. Eerie moaning sounds emanated seemingly from nowhere. Servants refused to stay on. New ones were hired but left after spending only a few days in the house. Even Linda Mudrick, the maid, left saying, "I never want to go into that Satan house again." Could Jane, in another dimension, have been aware of what was being done to her estate and her children's inheritance? Is it possible? May Mann, a columnist who was working on a biography of Jane and had all but the last few chapters finished at the time of the actress' death, told of numerous visits by Jane's ghost while the last 2 chapters were being written. She heard Jane's voice. "Please, please, please, you promised. Please, 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 you promised." Mann was repeatedly urged to complete the biography. The ghost's voice insisted that she wanted the world to know the truth about her and her life. On another occasion, Mrs. Mann locked the manuscript up for the night. No one else had access to it. Yet when she took it out the following day to resume writing, she was horrified to find blood splattered between nearly all the pages. This occurred at the same time that she was writing about Jane's fatal accident. In August 1978 issue of Death, a monthly tabloid that thrived on sensationalism, reporter Steve Becker interviewed Gray Tyler, an author, playwright, and intimate of many Hollywood celebrities. According to the article, after sacking the Pink Bel Air mansion, Jane's estranged husband Matt Keimer and his lawyers locked out the children and Jane's parents, then sold the place. There have been 5 tenants in the 37-room structure since Jane's death. The first occupants were a bank president and his family. Right after they moved in, the banker's 18-year-old son found a pink Honda motorcycle that the late actor Nick Adams had bought Jane after a brief affair. The boy started it up and took it for a spin around the estate, then decided to try it on the road. Roaring out past the iron gates and onto Sunset Boulevard, he was struck by a car and killed. The banker and his family moved out the same week. Singing star Mama Cass Elliot, a celebrity of the 1960s, was not associated with the occult. Not long after moving into the stately mansion, she went to London to tape some commercials, leaving her husband behind to oversee the redecorating of the mansion. Although she was thousands of miles from the house, she wasn't far enough away to escape the wrath that apparently was emanating from it. During her stay in London, she choked to death on a ham sandwich. Needless to say, her husband vacated the premises. Another tenant, after moving in, began to experience some strange phenomena. As stated in the death write-up, when alone, she was feeling she wasn't alone. She constantly felt an urge to bleach her hair, which she finally did after 3 weeks of restraint. She was finding herself reciting incantations that she knew nothing about. She felt compelled, especially in the rain, or in one rainy afternoon, as she was poking through the basement. She discovered a trunk full of Jane's clothes. After rummaging through the chest for several hours, she returned upstairs. That night she was awakened by an urge to return to the cellar. Sleepy-eyed, she donned her robe and walked down the steps. With no forethought whatsoever, she went directly to the trunk. Soon she found herself trying on practically every garment in the trunk. The garments didn't fit her too well. Thus, later that day, she took some of the garments to the seamstress for alterations. Next, she went to plastic surgery to arrange for a breast enlargement. When questioned by her friends, she responded that it was just something she was compelled to do. She could give no reason for the compulsion. Soon, anything to do with Jane Mansfield became an obsession with her. Whenever she heard of some Jane Mansfield memorabilia being offered for sale, she would rush off to buy it, and she had her bleached hair restyled to look like Jane's. It was as though she was possessed by the late witch. But that was not to be. For long, one night she woke and heard a woman's querulous voice calling to her, "Get out! Get out!" Aware of the fate that befell the previous two tenants, she packed up her belongings and fled from the Pink Mansion. The next occupant of the Pink Palace, according to Becker's article, was none other than Ringo Starr of the Beatles. The Beatles, incidentally, were ardent fans of Jane Mansfield while she was alive and were acquainted with her on a first-name basis and as well connected heavily with the occult. Although Ringo used the house mainly for parties and actually lived in it only for a short while, he had an entire exterior of the Pink House repainted white, but the house began turning pink again. Some claim that the reason was that pink is a hard color to cover with white paint. Others blamed it on the quality of the white paint, and then there were those who attributed it to Jane's energetic powers and presence. Again, the house was repainted using a sealer and 2 coats of white paint, but once again the house returned to pink. Paint consultants and chemists were unable to explain the phenomena. Eventually, the house was successfully repainted, for it is no longer pink. Next to occupy the mansion was a member of the Church of Satan who held regular satanic rituals within its walls. The Satanists never experienced any terrifying moments in the house, but Satanists deal with bizarre mysteries most of the time, and eerie happenings didn't shake him. However, they admitted to feeling the constant presence of Jane during their stay in the manor. It is possible that practitioners of the black arts are fully capable of restraining spirits from the other world, especially when the entity is one of their own. 2, it is possible that the disciples of the forces of darkness were responsible for Jane's hauntings and kept her around as long as they needed her. Or perhaps they were attempting to recompense for the black curse on Sam Brody that erroneously claimed the actress too. It is also possible that Jane just wanted her presence known by the Satanists because of her friendship with them during the last years of her life. Whatever the reason, the hauntings had diminished by the time the next occupant took over. Engelbert Humperdinck, who ironically was once involved romantically with Jane, purchased the mansion in 1977. Before he moved in, Humperdinck had a Catholic priest bless the house. In a statement issued by the press agent in June 1980, Humperdinck said, "I am very aware of the fact that the other people have speculated about my home, but I have never found anything that would validate them." He was replying to the question as to whether the house was still haunted. However, he added that after a recent earthquake, the ground settled, exposing a heart-shaped configuration, Jane's favorite pattern. Upon investigation, it was discovered to be a filled-in wading pool that Jane had built for her children. Haunted houses and ghosts. The hills of Hollywood are full of them. Most of those who share their homes with spiritual inhabitants and are aware of the situation have a tendency to deny such activities, probably out of fear of how others will interpret their admission of ghostly experiences. But there is ample evidence that Hollywood is a haven for haunters.